Have you ever noticed that history's most famous beauty was actually a political genius smarter than Caesar for more than 2,000 years? Cleopatra VII has been reduced to a single image, a seductive temptress, a woman whose beauty alone conquered the most powerful men in Rome, a figure whose legacy is tied not to her mind but to her looks. We see her in paintings and films, portrayed as a perfect specimen of feminine allure with flowing hair, striking features, and a gaze that could melt empires. But this image is a lie, a carefully crafted myth, a distortion of history that erases the true genius of one of the most brilliant minds the world has ever known. Cleopatra was not a beauty queen who stumbled into power. She was a strategic mastermind, a leader who spoke the language of her people, a diplomat who outmaneuvered Rome's greatest generals and politicians to protect her kingdom. Her story is not one of seduction, but of survival, of a woman who used every tool at her disposal, including the myth of her own beauty, to outsmart enemies far more powerful than herself. To understand Cleopatra, we must first unlearn the myth that has been forced upon her. She was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek rulers who had controlled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. For nearly 300 years, her family had ruled Egypt as foreign conquerors, clinging to their Greek language, their Greek customs, and their Greek identity. They saw themselves as superior to the Egyptian people they governed, refusing to learn the local language, refusing to engage with the local culture, and ruling with a sense of detachment that bred resentment. By the time Cleopatra was born, the Ptolemaic dynasty was crumbling. The kingdom was bankrupt, its borders were threatened by neighboring powers, and its people were growing increasingly restless under foreign rule. Most importantly, Rome, then the most powerful empire in the world, had set its sights on Egypt, a land of immense wealth, fertile farmland, and strategic importance. Egypt was a prize, and Rome was ready to claim it. Cleopatra was just 18 years old when her father, Ptolemy XIII, died, leaving her to rule alongside her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. It was a time of chaos and division. The court was split into factions, each vying for power, and Cleopatra quickly learned that survival depended on more than just her title. She was a young woman in a world dominated by men, a foreign ruler in a land that resented her family, and a target for Rome's growing ambition. But Cleopatra was not like the other Ptolemaic rulers. She refused to be a figurehead, refused to be controlled by the court's scheming advisors, and refused to see Egypt fall into Roman hands. She had a secret weapon. A weapon that no other Ptolemaic ruler had ever wielded. She spoke Egyptian. Not just a few words but fluently, with the ability to converse with her people, to understand their grievances, and to connect with them in a way that her Greek-speaking ancestors never could. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for 25 years before Cleopatra took the throne. Yet not one of her predecessors had bothered to learn the language of the people they governed. They spoke Greek in their palaces, conducted government business in Greek, and even issued coins and decrees in Greek. To them, Egyptian was the language of peasants and commoners, unworthy of a royal's time. But Cleopatra saw things differently. She recognized that to rule Egypt effectively, to gain the loyalty of her people, and to stand against Rome, she needed to be one of them. She dedicated herself to learning Egyptian, mastering not just the spoken language but also the written forms, including the sacred hieroglyphs, the priestly script known as demotic, and the everyday language of the people. She became the first and only Ptolemaic ruler to speak Egyptian, a decision that would change the course of her reign and the fate of Egypt. This ability to speak Egyptian was more than a novelty, it was a strategic masterstroke. It allowed her to communicate directly with the Egyptian people, to rally them behind her, and to present herself not as a foreign conqueror but as a true pharaoh, a descendant of the ancient Egyptian gods. She traveled to sacred sites across Egypt, participating in traditional rituals, speaking to priests and commoners alike in their own language, and embracing Egyptian culture in a way that no Ptolemaic ruler had done before. When a sacred bull named Apis died, a symbol of the god and a revered figure in Egyptian religion, Cleopatra personally traveled south to attend the ceremony to select a new bull, speaking to the priests and people in fluent Egyptian. This act of respect and solidarity won her the loyalty of the Egyptian people, who saw her not as a Greek interloper, but as their rightful leader. It also gave her a base of support that her enemies, both in the court and in Rome, could not ignore. While Cleopatra was building her support among the Egyptian people, she was also busy dismantling another myth, the myth of her own beauty. For centuries, we have been told that Cleopatra was one of the most beautiful women in history, that her looks alone were enough to make Caesar and Mark Antony abandon their duties, their wives, and their loyalty to Rome. But the historical evidence tells a different story. The only contemporary images we have of Cleopatra are not paintings or sculptures crafted by admirers, but coins minted during her reign, hard, unflinching records of her true appearance. These coins, discovered across the ancient world, paint a picture of a woman who was far from the ideal of modern beauty. One such coin, minted around 300 BCE and now housed in museums across Europe, features Cleopatra's portrait on one side and her lover Mark Antony's on the other. The image is striking, not for its beauty but for its realism. Cleopatra is depicted with a prominent, hooked nose, a broad forehead, a strong jawline, and thin lips. Her features are sharp, angular, and powerful, far from the soft, delicate features we associate with beauty in the modern world. Another coin, minted during her early reign, shows her with a similar appearance, a strong, unsmiling face, with no attempt to soften her features or conform to the Greek ideal of beauty. These coins were not crafted by enemies to mock her, they were official currency, minted by her own government. Intended to represent her as she truly was, they are the only reliable contemporary images we have of Cleopatra, and they tell us a clear truth: her power did not come from her looks. So why has the myth of Cleopatra's extraordinary beauty persisted for so long? The answer lies in Rome's propaganda machine. After Cleopatra's death, Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, set out to ice her, to paint her as a seductive, dangerous foreigner who had corrupted Rome's greatest leaders and threatened the very fabric of Roman society. He commissioned poets, historians, and artists to depict her as a beautiful but ruthless temptress, a woman who used her looks to manipulate men and gain power. This narrative was not just about discrediting Cleopatra, it was about justifying Rome's conquest of Egypt. If Cleopatra was a dangerous seductress, then Rome's invasion was a noble act, a defense of Roman virtue against Eastern corruption. Over time, this narrative became the accepted truth, and the real Cleopatra, the brilliant, multilingual diplomat, was forgotten. Cleopatra herself may have even embraced the myth of her beauty, using it as a tool in her diplomatic arsenal. She understood that Rome's leaders, raised on Greek ideals of beauty and power, would be more likely to underestimate a woman they saw as a seductive plaything than a strategic threat. She let them believe that her power came from her looks, while quietly using her intelligence, her language skills, and her understanding of Roman politics to outmaneuver them. It was a masterful act of misdirection, one that allowed her to survive and thrive in a world dominated by men who saw her as little more than a pretty face. The true test of Cleopatra's genius came when Rome's internal divisions spilled over into Egypt, forcing her to navigate a deadly game of politics and power. At the time, Rome was torn between two powerful leaders, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. The two had once been allies, but their ambition had turned them against each other, and a civil war had erupted. Pompey, defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus, fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with Cleopatra's brother, Ptolemy III. Ptolemy's advisors, eager to curry favor with Caesar, saw an opportunity to eliminate a Roman enemy and gain Caesar's support, they murdered Pompey, 砍下 his head, and sent it to Caesar as a gift. But their plan backfired. Caesar was horrified by the betrayal of a fellow Roman, and he arrived in Egypt, determined to bring order to the chaotic kingdom. Cleopatra, who had been exiled from the palace by her brother's faction, saw this as her chance to regain power. She knew that Caesar held the fate of Egypt in his hands, and she also knew that she could not hope to defeat him with military force. Instead, she used her wit and her understanding of Caesar's character to win him over. She had herself smuggled into Caesar's palace in Alexandria, hidden inside a rolled up carpet. When the carpet was unrolled before Caesar, Cleopatra emerged, calm, confident, and ready to negotiate. She did not beg for mercy, nor did she use seduction as her first weapon. She spoke to Caesar as an equal. Using her knowledge of Egyptian politics, her fluency in multiple languages, and her strategic mind to convince him that she was the only ruler capable of keeping Egypt stable and allied with Rome. Caesar, a man who prided himself on his intelligence and his ability to see through pretense, was impressed. He had expected a beautiful but empty headed queen, a woman who would throw herself at his feet. Instead, he found a sharp, articulate, and fiercely intelligent leader who understood the complexities of power. Cleopatra convinced him that supporting her would be in Rome's best interest. A stable Egypt would provide Rome with the grain it needed to feed its growing population, and an allied Egypt would act as a buffer against the expanding Parthian Empire. Caesar agreed, and he helped Cleopatra defeat her brother's forces, restoring her to the throne. In return, Cleopatra became Caesar's ally and later his lover, bearing him a son named Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. But Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar was not just a matter of love or convenience. It was a strategic move to protect Egypt's independence. She knew that Rome would eventually try to conquer Egypt, but by aligning herself with Caesar, she bought time, strengthened her position, and ensured that Egypt remained a sovereign kingdom, at least for a while. She traveled to Rome with Caesar, where she was treated as a visiting monarch, not a conquered ruler. She used her time in Rome to study Roman politics, to build alliances with powerful senators, and to learn everything she could about the empire that threatened her own. She even had a statue of herself erected in the temple of Venus Genetrix. A bold move that cemented her status as a powerful figure in Roman society. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's world was thrown into chaos. She was in Rome at the time, and she quickly realized that her position was precarious. Without Caesar's protection, she was vulnerable to Rome's wrath, and Egypt's independence was once again at risk. She fled Rome, returning to Egypt, where she consolidated her power, naming her son Caesarion as her co-jian ruler. She knew that Rome would soon turn its attention back to Egypt, and she began preparing for the next chapter in her diplomatic struggle. This time, the conflict was between Caesar's heirs, Octavian, his adopted son, and Mark Antony, his closest friend and ally. The two had split Rome's empire between them, with Antony ruling the eastern provinces and Octavian ruling the west. Cleopatra saw an opportunity to align herself with Antony, the more powerful of the two, and use his strength to protect Egypt. Antony, like Caesar before him, had heard the myth of Cleopatra's beauty, and he was eager to meet her. He summoned her to Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey, where he was preparing for a military campaign against the Parthians. Cleopatra arrived in style, aboard a magnificent ship adorned with purple sails and gold decorations, her servants dressed in silk and jewels. She played into the myth of her beauty, presenting herself as a goddess, Isis, the Egyptian goddess of fertility and power. But once again, her true power lay not in her appearance, but in her mind. She spoke to Antony in fluent Greek and Egyptian, impressing him with her knowledge of politics, military strategy, and diplomacy. She convinced him that Egypt could provide him with the resources he needed to defeat the Parthians and solidify his power in the east. In return, Antony recognized Cleopatra as the rightful ruler of Egypt, and he gave her control over several Roman provinces, including Cyprus, Syria, and parts of Arabia. Cleopatra's alliance with Antony was a masterclass in diplomatic maneuvering. She did not just become his lover, she became his most trusted advisor, using her influence to shape his decisions and ensure that Egypt's interests were protected. She bore him 3 children, and together they built a powerful alliance that threatened Octavian's control over Rome. But Octavian was not one to be outmaneuvered. He saw Cleopatra and Antony as a threat to his power, and he began a propaganda campaign to turn the Roman people against them. He accused Antony of being under Cleopatra's control, of betraying Rome by giving Roman territory to a foreign queen, and of planning to move Rome's capital to Alexandria. He even claimed to have found Antony's will, which supposedly stated that he wanted to be buried in Egypt with Cleopatra, a claim that enraged the Roman people, who saw it as a betrayal of Rome's honor. The stage was set for a final showdown between Octavian and the alliance of Antony and Cleopatra. In 311 BCE, their fleets met at the Battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. The battle was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra. Antony's fleet was defeated, and he fled to Egypt, with Octavian's forces in pursuit. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, tried to negotiate with Octavian, offering to surrender Egypt in exchange for her own life and the lives of her children. But Octavian was not interested in negotiations. He wanted complete control of Egypt, and he saw Cleopatra as a threat that could not be left alive. He surrounded Alexandria, cutting off all supplies to the city, and waited for Antony and Cleopatra to surrender. Antony, believing that Cleopatra had already committed suicide, fell on his sword when Cleopatra learned of his death. She knew that her time was up. She refused to be captured by Octavian, to be paraded through Rome as a trophy, to be mocked and humiliated for the amusement of the Roman people. Instead, she chose to end her own life, reportedly by allowing herself to be bitten by an asp, a symbol of the Egyptian goddess Isis, a final act of defiance against Rome. Her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the beginning of Roman rule over Egypt, but it did not mark the end of her legacy. For more than 2,000 years, Cleopatra has been remembered as a beautiful seductress, a woman who used her looks to manipulate men and gain power. But this is a gross oversimplification of a woman who was one of the greatest diplomatic geniuses of all time. She was the only Ptolemaic ruler to speak the language of her people, a decision that won her their loyalty and allowed her to rule effectively. She used the myth of her beauty as a tool, letting her enemies underestimate her while she outmaneuvered them with her intelligence and strategic mind. She navigated the deadly politics of Rome's civil wars, allying herself with the most powerful men in the empire to protect Egypt's independence for as long as possible. She was not a victim of her beauty. She was a master of her own destiny, a woman who refused to be defined by the men around her. The coins that bear her true image tell a story of a strong, powerful woman, not a beautiful one. The historical records speak of a multilingual diplomat, a strategic leader, a ruler who fought tirelessly to protect her kingdom. Cleopatra was smarter than Caesar, more cunning than Antony, and more resilient than any of her enemies. She understood that in a world dominated by men, power came not from beauty but from intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to outthink those who would seek to destroy you. She used Rome's own divisions against it, turning its leaders against each other to keep Egypt free. She was a black swan in a world of predictable politics, a woman who defied expectations and left an indelible mark on history. Today, we still struggle to see Cleopatra for who she truly was. We are drawn to the myth of the beautiful seductress, to the idea of a woman who conquered empires with a single glance. But the real Cleopatra is far more fascinating. She was a leader who spoke the language of her people, a diplomat who outsmarted Rome's greatest minds. A woman who refused to be a victim of her circumstances. She was a genius, plain and simple. A genius who happened to be a woman in a time when women were not supposed to be geniuses. She was a reminder that power does not come from looks, or from birth, or from the men who support you. It comes from within, from intelligence, from resilience, from the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when the odds are stacked against you. Cleopatra's story is not just about the fall of a kingdom or the rise of an empire. It is about the power of perception, about how history can be rewritten to suit the needs of the powerful. It is about the danger of reducing women to their looks, of ignoring their intelligence and their achievements. It is about a woman who refused to be erased, who used every tool at her disposal to make her mark on the world. She was more than a beauty. She was a political genius, a diplomatic mastermind, and one of the most remarkable women in history. When we look at the coins that bear her true image, we see a woman who was not afraid to be herself, strong, unapologetic, and brilliant. We see a woman who outsmarted Caesar, who outmaneuvered Rome, who fought for her people and her kingdom until the very end. She was not perfect, she made mistakes. She was ruthless when she needed to be, and she made choices that cost lives. But she was human. A human who rose above her circumstances, who defied the expectations of her time, and who left a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire us today. Cleopatra's legacy is not in the myth of her beauty. It is in her intelligence, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to protecting her people. She was a woman who proved that beauty is fleeting, but genius is eternal. She was a political genius, smarter than Caesar, a diplomat who changed the course of history, and a leader who refused to be forgotten. Her story is a testament to the power of one woman to make a difference, even in a world dominated by men, and it is a reminder that the most dangerous weapon in any battle is not a sword, or an army, or even beauty. It is the human mind. The Imperial Shadows are full of stories of powerful figures, but few are as misunderstood as Cleopatra. She was a woman who was ahead of her time, a genius trapped in a world that could not see past her gender and her image. But her true legacy will not be erased. It lives on in the coins that bear her image, in the historical records that speak of her intelligence, and in the hearts of those who recognize her for who she truly was, a political genius, a diplomatic mastermind, and a woman who outsmarted Caesar and changed the course of history.